A dog had been left in a dry creek to die, ribs showing, blood on one leg, barely breathing under the burning sun. When a former Navy SEAL stepped down to help, he found something no dying stray should have been wearing: a tactical collar. Minutes later, a sheriff's truck blocked the only road out, like they had been waiting for that dog to be found.
Where exactly
In that
do you
moment,
think you're going, Mr. Creed?
the rescue stopped
Nowhere
feeling
until he
like
gets some
mercy
help, Sheriff.
and started
Now
feeling
step
like
aside.
someone was trying to cover their tracks. Then the dog did something even stranger. It turned back toward the place that had nearly killed it. Like beneath that dead red earth, it was trying to lead him to something buried, hidden, and not meant to be seen. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Share your thoughts after the story, and please like and subscribe. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers so we can keep telling stories like this. Morning in Arroyo County came hard and dry, as if the land had forgotten that mercy was once part of weather. The road Jonas Creed followed was not much more than a pale wound cut through dust and scrub, winding past dead grass, rusted fence posts, and a line of low hills that looked burned even when the sun had barely risen. He drove slowly in an old pickup that rattled over every stone, one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the gear shift out of habit rather than need. Men like Jonas seldom looked restless from the outside. Restlessness in them had learned to sit very still. At 35, Jonas carried the kind of strength that seemed to have gathered quietly over time rather than been built for display. He stood a little over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders without heaviness, lean through the waist, with the contained balance of a man who had spent years teaching his body to obey before fear could speak. His face was weathered in a way that belonged less to age than to wind, distance, and long seasons outdoors. Silver had begun to work its way through his close-cropped hair, especially at the temples, and the light stubble along his jaw only sharpened the hard lines of his cheekbones and the steady plane of his mouth. There was something northern in him now, something lake country and cold air worn, though he lived far from any shore that could soften a man. His old olive shirt clung dark at the chest with sweat, and his brown field jacket had been broken in by years rather than fashion. He looked, at first glance, like the sort of man who fixed fences, hauled feed, and preferred not to be asked questions. At second glance, people usually understood there was an older life under the quieter one. He had come out this way to check a damaged water line that fed a horse property outside town. It was the kind of work he liked, because it required his hands and not much else. But as he passed a dry creek bed half hidden below the rise, something at the bottom caught his eye. A slash of yellow-black against stone and red dust. He braked. For a second, he thought it was a coyote carcass. Then he saw the shape of the ribs lifting faintly. Jonas killed the engine and stepped out into heat that had already started building under the morning sun. The air smelled of dust, hot weeds, and old metal. He moved down the slope carefully, boots slipping on loose gravel, eyes fixed on the animal below. It was a Belgian Malinois. The dog lay twisted on its side in the creek bed, as if it had fallen there and run out of strength before it could rise again. It was around 5 years old, yellow-black, built fine and hard, like a working dog rather than a pet. Even half dead, it still had the narrow, intelligent face of an animal made for discipline and speed. One foreleg was torn open near the wrist. Dried blood darkened the fur along its belly. Its chest moved in shallow, uneven pulls. Around its neck sat a worn black tactical collar, the kind designed for utility, not comfort. Jonas crouched a few feet away, first instead of reaching in. "Easy," he said, his voice low. "I'm not in a hurry. You don't have to be either." The dog did not lift its head, but one ear twitched. That tiny movement hit him harder than it should have. He took off his jacket and laid it within reach. Then he looked around, and that was when the scene changed. Half under a clump of dry grass lay a used syringe, not old, not sun-faded. Near it was a broken drag strap, the nylon end frayed as if torn loose in haste. A few feet farther up the bank, fresh tire marks had pressed deep into the hard earth. Someone had been here recently. Someone had brought the dog, or tried to take it, or both. Jonas shifted his weight to plant his boot, and the edge of the creek bank suddenly gave way beneath him. He jerked back in time as gravel slid off and exposed a length of rusted wire and broken metal stakes hidden under dirt and scrub. Not a natural collapse. Not entirely. A trap or the remains of one. He stood very still for a moment, looking down at the dog again. "This wasn't where you were meant to be found," he murmured. He pulled his field kit from the truck, returned, and worked carefully. Water first, but only a little, wetting the dog's mouth, not flooding it. Then gums, pulse, eyes, dehydration, shock, possible sedation. His hands moved with the old efficiency of training that never really left a man. But beneath that precision, something older and less disciplined had already begun to stir. Years earlier, in a place of white rock and helicopter noise, he had once put his hand on a military dog that was still warm and known he was leaving without it. He had followed orders. That fact had never once comforted him. He slipped a small fluid pack into place to buy time. As he did, the dog's eyes opened. Amber brown, clouded with exhaustion, but not empty. There was still rankness in that stare. Suspicion. Defiance. The stubborn, disciplined refusal to surrender trust simply because death was close. Jonas felt something in his chest tighten, not dramatically, not all at once, more like an old buried shard shifting under scar tissue. "All right," he said softly. "I see you." He slid one arm beneath the dog's chest and the other under its hindquarters. The animal was lighter than it should have been. Even in pain, it stayed rigid, as if some last remnant of training still insisted on composure. Jonas carried it up to the truck and set it gently across the back seat on his jacket. As soon as he shut the door, he heard it. A motor somewhere far off. Not approaching, not leaving. Just there for a second in the distance, then suddenly cut. He turned toward the sound, but the land gave him nothing. Heat shimmer, low scrub. A line of pale road disappearing into glare. Someone had come back and seen him. He got in the truck and headed toward San Mateo, where Elena Ruiz ran the nearest veterinary clinic worth trusting. About 10 minutes later, he rounded a bend and found a sheriff's SUV parked broadside across the dirt road. Jonas slowed, then stopped. Sheriff Doyle Kerr stepped out and shut the door with calm, deliberate care. He was in his middle 50s, tall and raw-boned, with the lingering strength of a man who had never entirely gone soft. His face was deeply lined from sun and years spent being looked at by other people for answers. Silver threaded his hair at the temples beneath the brim of his hat. Nothing in him was loud. That was the trouble. Men like Kerr frightened people not because they shouted, but because they had learned how much could be controlled without raising their voice. He approached the truck and bent just enough to look in through the open window. "Morning, Jonas." Jonas did not answer the familiarity in the greeting. "Sheriff?" Kerr's gaze flicked once toward the back seat. "Dog still alive?" "Barely." Kerr nodded as if confirming a timetable. Then he said, in the same even tone, "You found it sooner than I expected." Jonas looked at him, not because the words were loud, because they were not. For a moment the dry morning seemed to lose all sound. Even the wind held back. Kerr rested one hand on the window frame. "We may have a county matter here. Possible working animal connected to an old file. I'll escort you to the clinic. Maintain chain of custody." It was reasonable language. Clean language. Language designed to sit between suspicion and proof. Jonas said, "Funny. I didn't mention where I found him." Kerr's eyes did not change. "News travels." No. Not news, Jonas thought. Tracking. Then something happened that neither man could fold neatly into talk. From the back seat came a movement so abrupt, it sounded like cloth scraping leather. The Malinois, who had barely had the strength to breathe, dragged itself half upright. Its lips pulled back. A low growl rose from somewhere deep and ragged inside its chest. Not panic. Recognition. Not fear alone, either. There was hatred in it, raw, immediate, and personal. Kerr's hand tightened once on the doorframe before he let it go. A tiny movement. Most men would have missed it. Jonas did not. The dog kept staring past him, every remaining ounce of life focused on the sheriff. Kerr straightened. Like I said, could be evidence. Jonas held his gaze. Could be. For one suspended second, neither of them moved, and the heat seemed to lean in around the truck. Then Jonas reached up and rolled the window nearly closed. I'm taking him to the clinic, he said. You can follow if that makes you feel useful. Kerr stepped back. I'm not the one you should worry about, Jonas. That line might have carried more weight if the dog had not still been growling behind him. Jonas shifted into gear. As he pulled away, he watched in the mirror while Kerr returned to his SUV without any outward sign of urgency. That bothered him more than if the man had barked, threatened, or reached for authority. Kerr did not look like someone improvising. He looked like someone adjusting to a detail he had hoped would go differently. A mile passed, then another. Soon the sheriff's vehicle appeared in the rearview mirror at an exact, measured distance, never crowding, never falling away. Behind Jonas, the Malinois had collapsed again, though not fully. Its head rested against the seat, breathing shallow. Once, when Jonas glanced back, one amber eye opened to a slit, then closed. Hold on, he said, not loudly. Just hold on. The road stretched ahead in a pale line through scrub and sun-struck emptiness. Behind him, Doyle Kerr followed with the patience of a man who believed every road in Arroyo County eventually bent back toward his hand. The dog should not have had the strength to lift its head, let alone growl. Yet the moment Doyle Kerr leaned near the truck, something old and violent woke in it. Not confusion, not pain, but recognition. And for the first time that morning, Jonas stopped feeling like he had rescued an animal. He began to feel that he had interrupted something. Elena Ruiz's clinic sat on the edge of San Mateo like something built less for business than for endurance. The building was small and sun-faded, with peeling white paint along the window trim, and a porch that leaned just enough to suggest years of weather rather than neglect. A hand-painted sign hung above the entrance, its letters cracked but still legible. Inside, the place smelled of antiseptic, clean gauze, old wood, and the faint, dry sweetness of hay that always seemed to cling to country clinics no matter how hard they were scrubbed. When Jonas carried the Malinois through the door, Elena came out from the back room without wasting a second on surprise. She was 42, of medium height, strong in the quiet, practical way of a woman who had spent years lifting frightened animals, hauling feed bags, and standing on her feet through bad nights without announcing the cost of it. Her dark brown hair was tied low at the nape of her neck, already coming loose in a few strands around her temples. Her face was not soft in the decorative sense, but there was steadiness in it, and intelligence, and the kind of calm that did not depend on the world behaving well. Her skin had the warm olive cast of someone who belonged more to daylight and hard work than to offices. She wore a faded blue-gray Henley under a canvas work jacket, dark jeans and scuffed brown boots, and she moved with the kind of economy that made panic feel almost embarrassing in her presence. "What happened?" she asked, already clearing the metal exam table. "Found him in a dry creek bed," Jonas said. "Half dead, maybe drugged." Elena glanced once at the dog, then at Jonas, then back at the dog. "Bring him here." The Malinois made a low sound as Jonas laid him down, but it was not a protest so much as a warning that he was still in there somewhere. Elena checked the gums first, then the eyes, then the torn foreleg. Her hands were quick and exact. She said nothing for nearly a minute, and that silence did more to tighten Jonas's chest than if she had started naming dangers aloud. Finally, she exhaled through her nose. "Severe dehydration, shock, tissue damage in the leg, but it's not the worst of it." She touched the fur gently at the back of the dog's neck and frowned. "There's an old puncture here." Jonas stepped closer. "Needle?" "Looks like it." The dog's tactical collar came off only after Elena cut away a layer of dirty wrap beneath it. Up close, the animal looked worse than he had in the truck. Rib lines too visible, flank twitching with effort, one ear nicked, fur matted with red dirt. Yet even unconscious, he did not look broken. He looked suspended, as if some hard part of him had refused to lie down with the rest. Elena paused as her thumb brushed the inner seam of the collar. This isn't standard. Jonas saw it then, a recessed latch set so neatly into the leather and nylon that it might have escaped anyone not looking for it. He took a small tool from his pocket, pressed carefully, and heard a click. A hidden compartment opened. Inside lay a compact GPS unit, a micro SD card sealed in plastic, and a square of cloth folded twice over. Elena looked at him. That's not rancher equipment. Jonas unfolded the cloth. 3 words, written in a hurried, unsteady hand, had bled into the old brown stain beneath them. Don't trust Kerr. For a moment the room seemed to narrow around those words. Elena's eyes lifted first. You know him? Sheriff stopped me on the road. And? He knew too much. Elena did not ask for an explanation immediately. She had the instinct, rare in decent people, to recognize when a thing became more dangerous by being spoken too soon. Instead, she slid an IV into the dog's leg, started fluids, and called over her shoulder for warm blankets and antibiotics, as if there were still such a thing as an ordinary order of priorities. Outside, a vehicle door shut. Jonas turned toward the front window. Sheriff Doyle Kerr stood beside his SUV under the hard afternoon light, speaking to an older couple near the porch with the relaxed authority of a man accustomed to being listened to. He removed his hat, smiled faintly, shook the husband's hand, and tipped his head at something the wife said. From inside the clinic, through the dusty glass, he looked exactly like what people in a county like this wanted their sheriff to look like. Controlled, capable, and interested in order. That, Jonas thought, was how rot lasted so long. It learned good manners. By dusk, the Malinois had stabilized enough that Elena let herself sit down for the first time in hours. She wrote notes while Jonas stood by the sink trying to clean dried blood from his hands. What are you calling him? She asked without looking up. Jonas turned. I'm not calling him anything. She lifted one eyebrow. Then I guess I'll keep writing male Malinois, unidentified, until he dies or improves. The dog's ear twitched at the sound of their voices. Jonas looked over at him. Rook, he said before he had time to think about it. Elena glanced up. That from the GPS? He nodded. It fits. The first strange thing happened after dark. The power cut out all at once, dropping the clinic into a silence so sudden it felt staged. The hum of the old refrigerator stopped. The fluorescent lights died. For half a beat, the only sound was the soft ticking of cooling equipment. Then the battery backup on the IV pump kicked in with a sharp mechanical chirp. Elena swore under her breath and reached for a flashlight. Jonas was already moving. He checked the breaker box behind the building and found it intact. No storm, no blown fuse. The rear service door, however, stood slightly ajar. He shone the beam across the concrete floor inside the storage room and saw fresh mud tracked in from outside. One set of prints, maybe boots, maybe overshoes. Careful, measured. Not the wandering marks of a thief looking for valuables. Nothing obvious had been taken. Shelves remained stocked. Cabinets were still shut. The cash tin was untouched. When he came back inside, Elena was in the office with the security monitor open. Camera feed's gone, she said. System failure. She shook her head once. No, just the archive. Everything from late afternoon through now has been wiped. Jonas looked at the dog on the treatment table. Whoever had come in here had not wanted money, drugs, or equipment. They had wanted absence. The night deepened around the clinic, pressing against the windows. Elena made coffee neither of them needed, and neither of them tasted. Around midnight, when the building finally settled into uneasy stillness, Jonas pulled a chair beside the exam room and stayed there with his jacket on and his boots unlaced, but not removed. Rook slept fitfully. Once his paws jerked as if running in place. Another time a low, involuntary sound moved through him, so brief Jonas almost thought he imagined it. He had heard that sound before too, years ago, from men and animals both, the sound of a body crossing back through something it had not finished surviving. At dawn, Elena found foam and streaks of diluted blood near the drain under the table. She crouched, touched it with gauze, and went still. Then she walked to the back door, opened it, and found a scrap of raw meat in the dust just beyond the threshold. Her face changed when she picked it up. "This wasn't left by an animal," she said. "Look." Inside the meat was the crushed edge of a tablet. Rook, too weak to eat much, had taken enough to sicken him, but not enough to die. Elena straightened slowly. They weren't trying to recover him. They were trying to finish him. A colder discovery waited inside. One vial of veterinary sedative was missing from the locked cabinet. Jonas stared at the empty space on the shelf. "So if the poison didn't work, they could come back later," Elena said. "Use my own inventory, and if anyone asks, I become the idiot who overdosed a half-dead dog already in shock." She said it flatly, but anger had entered her voice now, and beneath that anger lay something more personal. Insult. Not merely threat. Violation. Late that afternoon, a county vehicle parked across from the clinic and remained there for hours. No one got out. No one knocked. The engine turned off. A silhouette stayed behind the windshield, barely visible in the shifting glare. The message was so clean it hardly needed translation. "We know where you are, and we can afford to wait longer than you can." Patients began canceling by evening. One woman who usually brought in blue heelers from a nearby ranch called and said she had decided to use someone closer to the county office for now. Another simply did not show. Elena hung up after the second call and set the phone down very carefully. "People are nervous," she said. "No," Jonas replied. "People are being trained." She looked at him. He did not explain. He did not need to. They both understood the shape of it by now. That night, after locking the back kennels himself, Jonas made one last round of the building. On his way past the rear run, he stopped. One kennel door stood open an inch. Nothing inside had been touched. No animals were missing. No equipment had been disturbed. It was just open enough to matter. Just open enough to say, "We can come in whenever we want." He closed it, tested the latch, and stood there a moment with his hand on the metal. When he returned to the exam room, Rook was awake. The dog was still weak, still bandaged, still visibly shaking under the blanket now and then, but his eyes were clear in a way they had not been the day before. He was looking not at Jonas, but toward the back hallway. Listening. For what, Jonas did not know. He moved closer and laid a hand lightly on the edge of the table, not touching the dog, just making his presence plain. "You're not dead yet," he said. Rook's gaze shifted to him then, wary but steady. Neither of them trusted easily. Perhaps that was why the quiet between them did not feel empty. Near closing time on the second day, Kerr finally came inside. He removed his hat, wiped a trace of dust from the brim with one thumb, looked around the room with composed interest. "Elena," he said. "Jonas." His voice was polite enough to be mistaken for concern by anyone who had not yet learned how danger often presented itself in clean boots and measured sentences. Elena stood with her shoulders square. "We're closed." Kerr's mouth twitched at one corner, not quite a smile. "I'm only here to be helpful." "No one believes that," Jonas said. Kerr turned to him, and for the first time that day, the clinic felt too small. He glanced toward Rook, then back. "If you were wise, you'd turn the animal over before things that don't belong to you start arriving at your door." There was no threat in his tone. That was what made it worse. He spoke as if offering weather advice to a man about to drive into a storm. Then he put his hat back on and left. The door shut softly behind him. And somehow that softness was more unsettling than a slam would have been. An hour after sunset, when the clinic had gone still again, Jonas heard a faint metallic sound from the treatment room. Not loud, just a delicate little tap like something hard knocking once against steel. He stepped inside and found Rook staring at the hidden compartment in his own collar, his whole body trembling, not from weakness this time, but from memory. The dog lowered his head, gave one small, strained whine, and then looked toward the dark window as if he had just heard someone who was no longer alive. By the third morning, the town had begun to turn its face away. It happened in the ordinary places first, which made it feel uglier. At the diner off Main, conversation thinned when Jonas walked in, then picked up again once he passed. At the gas station, the owner glanced past him toward the county truck parked half a block away, then pretended to be busy wiping down a coffee machine that was already clean. A woman Elena had treated for years called to say she wanted her dog's records transferred closer to home, though the woman lived exactly where she always had. No one said anything direct. No one needed to. In a small town, disapproval was often delivered by subtraction. Jonas had seen hostility in louder forms. He had seen men kick doors, strip rifles, raise their voices, and mistake volume for strength. This was different. This was a community learning, all at once, how to make a person feel unclaimed. He left the diner with untouched coffee cooling in a paper cup and drove back to the clinic under a white, unforgiving sky. Dust followed the truck in a long, pale ribbon behind him. The county vehicle he had noticed earlier did not tail him openly, but he saw it twice in the mirror on roads where it had no business being. When he pulled behind Elena's clinic, she was unloading feed sacks from the back of her own truck. She glanced up, saw his face, and did not waste time pretending not to understand it. "Bad morning?" she asked. "Just human." That earned the faintest hint of a smile, but it vanished quickly. Rook kept trying to stand before sunrise. Jonas set the coffee on the porch rail and followed her inside. The clinic felt smaller than it had the day before. Maybe because trouble had already learned the shape of the rooms. Maybe because exhaustion had a way of shrinking whatever was supposed to be safe. Rook lay on a blanket in the treatment room, still weak but no longer drifting in and out the way he had before. The IV was gone. His bandaged foreleg was stretched awkwardly in front of him. He lifted his head when Jonas entered, then lowered it again without quite relaxing. The dog's face had sharpened now that shock was loosening its grip. He was not a broad, imposing animal like a German shepherd. He was finer cut than that, made for speed and decision, all hard tendon and alert angles. Even sick, there was a tension in him that made the room feel occupied in a different way. Elena checked his gums again, adjusted a bandage, then said quietly, "He's holding on." Jonas nodded, but before he could answer, there was a knock at the rear service door. Not loud, not hesitant either. 3 measured taps. Elena and Jonas both went still. Jonas reached the door first and opened it only part way. The man standing outside looked as though the years had not simply passed over him, but leaned on him. He was in his early 60s, tall once and still somewhat tall, though his shoulders had settled forward from too much driving, too much carrying, too much choosing silence over sleep. His name, when he gave it, was Harlan Pike. Harlan had the weathered face of a man who had lived most of his life under open sky. His skin was sun-browned and lined deep around the eyes and mouth. His silver hair was thin beneath an old cap worn soft at the brim. His jaw still had a stubborn shape to it, but the rest of him looked tired in a way that went beyond age. He wore a denim shirt under a faded brown work jacket, oil-stained at one cuff, and dusty boots that had probably stepped in more loading yards than kitchens. Nothing in him suggested drama. Everything in him suggested attrition. "I need 5 minutes," he said. His voice was rough and low, not from authority, but from disuse. The voice of a man who had spent too many years speaking only when necessary and was no longer certain necessity would protect him. Jonas looked at him for another beat, then stepped aside. Harlan came in with the wariness of someone entering not just a room, but a decision. He removed his cap, turned it in his hands once, and kept standing until Elena pointed him toward a chair. He did not sit immediately. His eyes moved through the room and stopped on Rook. The dog did not growl, but every muscle along his neck tightened. Harlan saw that and swallowed. "I never liked what they turned those dogs into," he said. Jonas leaned against the counter, arms folded. "Start there." For a while, Harlan did not. He started somewhere safer, at least for him. He spoke about the drought years, about men losing cattle they had raised from birth because the ground cracked before the well trucks came, about medicine becoming a math problem for older couples, about land auctions where neighbors stood pretending not to recognize one another's grief. He talked about Doyle Kerr, the way a person speaks of a man they had once defended in too many rooms, carefully, with old loyalty still hanging from the edges of each sentence like frayed thread. "Kerr helped people," Harlan said at last. "That's the part nobody wants to throw away. There were families kept on their feet because he knew which forms to move faster, who to lean on, where to find emergency deliveries when the county office was too slow or too broke." He rubbed a hand over his mouth. "That's how it starts, I guess. Not with evil, with relief." Jonas said nothing. Harlan finally sat. Up close, the tremor in his hands became visible. Not fear exactly, not all of it. Some of it was age, some exhaustion, some the strain of a man whose conscience had grown heavier than his excuses. He pulled 3 things from inside his jacket and placed them on the metal table one by one. A micro SD card in a small plastic sleeve, a narrow black ledger with dates and cargo weights handwritten in careful block print, and a brass key on a ring marked with an old warehouse tag. Elena looked at the objects, then at Harlan. "What is this?" "A part of what I should have handed over a long time ago." Jonas picked up the ledger first. Several entries had been crossed out and rewritten. Routes labeled as agricultural supply runs did not match the mileage. Food deliveries showed weights too heavy for canned goods and too light for feed. A handful of transport logs passed through Sierra Grain Cooperative after midnight, then disappeared from the following pages as if someone had tried to rewrite the record from memory and done it badly. "What's Sierra Grain?" Elena asked. "Old storage property outside Arroyo," Harlan said. "Supposed to be dead. Hasn't been dead in years." Jonas held up the SD card. "And this?" Harlan looked at it as if it might indict him by touch. "Video. Bits of it. Things I copied before the office system got cleaned out." He nodded toward the computer on Elena's desk. "If you open it, do it with the blinds shut." They did. The footage was grainy and dark, but not useless. The first clip showed county trucks arriving at Sierra Grain well past midnight, their side panels stamped with food assistance markings. Men unloaded crates fast, heads down, no wasted movement. In another clip, floodlights swept across the edge of a yard enclosed by corrugated steel fencing. A dog crossed the frame on a long lead, lean-bodied and alert. Beside it walked a man Jonas had never seen before. "That's Eli Mercer," Harlan said quietly. The camera zoom was poor, but the man's outline held. Mid-40s perhaps, wire lean, cap pulled low, a handler's posture, attentive without tension, someone long accustomed to reading animals and suspicious men with equal seriousness. In the next fragment, Eli stood talking to Kerr near a loading bay. Kerr's expression was unreadable from that distance. Eli's body language was not. Even through the blur, he looked like a moth arguing while trying not to be seen arguing. Another clip. Trucks leaving. A floodlight cutting out. Kerr stepping alone from a side door after the yard had gone black. Elena folded her arms. "Why didn't you take this to the state police?" Harlan let out a breath that sounded almost embarrassed. "Because by then I'd already spent years telling myself there was a line they hadn't crossed." He looked at Rook again. "Then one day I understood the line had been back there somewhere, miles behind me, and I'd kept driving." Jonas asked, "What happened to Mercer?" Harlan stared at the desk. Officially, debt, said he took off. His mouth tightened. I hauled county loads all my life. I know the difference between a man leaving and a man being removed from the story. Silence filled in what he did not say. Then Harlan leaned forward, lowered his voice, and for the first time looked Jonas directly in the eye. I don't know when keeping the county alive turned into burying people, he said, but I know it did. That landed harder than anger would have. He stood to leave almost immediately after, as if sitting with the truth too long might make him too afraid to carry it any farther. At the door, he hesitated. If you want to know where the real movement happens, he said, don't just watch the warehouse. Watch where water used to run. Then he went out the back and did not look over his shoulder. Rook waited until the sound of Harlan's truck had faded. Then, with a slowness that made the effort almost painful to watch, he pushed himself upright on 3 legs and limped to the door Harlan had used. He lowered his nose to the threshold, inhaled once, and let out a small, broken sound. Not fear, not warning, but something closer to recognition soaked in grief. For a moment, Jonas had the strange, unwelcome feeling that the dog had not just identified a scent. He had remembered a man who had once arrived too late. The next morning, Jonas drove out to Harlan Pike's place before the sun had properly settled into the sky. The property sat outside town on a patch of flat land with 2 dying mesquite trees, a rusting trailer frame in the yard, and a porch that looked one storm away from collapse. It was the kind of place built by someone who expected to fix things later and then ran out of later. Harlan's truck was there. The engine was still running. Jonas stopped so hard the pickup skidded in the dirt. He was out of the cab before the dust settled. The driver's door of Harlan's truck stood open. The radio murmured low through static, some local host giving a weather report no one needed. A paper cup of coffee sat in the holder. Steam no longer rising from it, but the lid still warm. On the passenger seat lay a folded utility receipt and an old pair of reading glasses. There was no sign of a struggle big enough to leave wreckage. Only one thing looked wrong. A smear of dried blood, small but undeniable, marked the edge of the passenger seat. Jonas scanned the yard, the porch, the brush line beyond the house. Nothing moved. Then he saw the windshield. Across the film of dust, someone had written with a finger. Under the creek, not neat letters, not panicked ones either. The words had been formed quickly, by a hand that knew it was out of time but had chosen legibility over desperation. Jonas stood there longer than he should have. This was the worst kind of absence. Not uncertain enough to call accident. Not obvious enough to call murder. Just clean enough to invite denial from anyone who wanted one. He searched the house anyway. Inside, the place smelled of old coffee, motor oil, and the stale stillness of a man who lived mostly alone. The kitchen sink held 1 plate. The bed was unmade. A framed photograph on the wall showed Harlan years younger beside a smiling woman with silver blonde hair and tired, kind eyes. Another picture, more recent, showed the same woman thinner, seated, covered in a blanket, on what looked like a hospice porch. That explained part of the ledger, part of the silence, part of the delay. A man did not need greed to stay quiet. Sometimes all he needed was one person he could not afford to lose before the month ran out. Jonas left with the feeling that the house had been emptied of more than a body. When he returned to the clinic, Elena read the words on the windshield from the photograph he had taken and went pale in a way she would have denied if asked. You think he wrote it? Yes. You think they took him alive? Jonas did not answer immediately. Alive long enough to finish the sentence. That was enough. He showed her the photo from the wall, the one with Harlan's wife. Elena stared at it, then at the ledger on her desk. That's why he waited. Medical bills. Maybe care costs. Maybe just fear. She shook her head once. People always think corruption needs monsters. Half the time it only needs tired men with something left to lose. Later that evening, when the clinic finally quieted, Jonas reopened the video files from the SD card and listened instead of watched. The visual evidence mattered. The audio might matter more. Wind, engines, boots on gravel, a loading door rattling shut. Somewhere in the distance, a brief metallic jingle. He stopped the recording, played it again. There it was. Faint. Distinct. A small bell or tag striking metal. At once Rook, who had been lying with his head on his paws beneath the exam table, snapped upright so fast the table legs scraped against the floor. Every line of the dog changed. He was no longer recovering, no longer resting. He stood rigid, ears forward, eyes fixed not on the screen, but on some point beyond it. His breathing turned sharp and shallow. Then he moved, 3 limping steps toward the computer, 1 toward the back wall, then stopped and stared at the concrete, as if the sound had opened a door under the room. Jonas cut the audio immediately. Rook did not calm. He kept staring at nothing visible, body locked in the posture of an animal dragged back into a memory, strong enough to override pain. Elena spoke softly. "What was that?" Jonas looked at the frozen waveform on the screen. A sound he knows. Outside, night pressed tight against the windows. Inside, the clinic seemed to hold its breath. And for the first time since he had found the dog in the creek bed, Jonas understood that whatever had happened at Sierra Grain, or beneath it, had not merely frightened Rook. It had marked him. By the time Jonas began sorting through Harlan Pike's ledger in earnest, Arroyo County no longer felt like a place made of roads, fences, and buildings. It felt like a body trying not to confess what had poisoned it. The pages in front of him were old-fashioned in a way that made the lies harder to dismiss. Harlan had written everything in neat block letters with a mechanic's patience. Dates, cargo weights, delivery times, route numbers. There was nothing theatrical about the entries. That was what made them persuasive. Men who invented stories usually left themselves flourishes. Men who spent their lives hauling freight left lines, numbers, mileage, and the sort of ordinary details no one thought to fear until fear was already too late. Elena sat across from him at the clinic desk, one boot tucked under her chair, her hair falling looser than usual around her face. It was past midnight. The clinic lights had been turned off everywhere except the office and treatment room, leaving most of the building in a hush that felt borrowed rather than natural. Outside, the windows reflected back their own tired faces. They had spread Harlan's things across the desk. The key, the rewritten routes, the photographs Jonas had taken at Harlan's house, and the plastic sleeve containing the SD card. The county truck had not returned that evening, but neither of them had mistaken its absence for mercy. Jonas traced one route with his finger. Sierra Grain again. Elena leaned closer. And again. Not just the warehouse. The same trucks that supposedly carried food aid and agricultural supplies kept passing one other point over and over, a stretch of land close to the dry creek bed where Jonas had found Rook. Not directly on paper, never cleanly enough to form an accusation on its own, but repeatedly, like a sentence someone kept trying to erase and only managed to smear. "The warehouse is the face," Jonas said. Elena looked up. "And the creek? The lungs, or the throat." She was quiet for a second. "That's a cheerful metaphor. It's late. Late is when men say what they mean." That earned the briefest tilt at the corner of Jonas's mouth, though it vanished almost immediately. On the blanket in the treatment room, Rook lifted his head. He was stronger now, though not nearly strong enough to trust. The yellow-black lines of his body had begun to fill back into themselves, but he still moved like an animal, negotiating pain in silence. His foreleg remained bandaged. His tactical collar lay dismantled on the counter, the hidden compartment now empty. Its mystery moved into cables, files, and memory. He watched Jonas and Elena not like a dog waiting for food or praise, but like a sentry assigned to people he had not fully decided deserved survival. Jonas went back to the computer and tried the decryption process again on the GPS module. He had managed only fragments so far. Timestamps, route logs, partial pings. This time, one section finally opened. A map appeared. Sparse. Incomplete. But enough. He stared at it without speaking, then it hauled back slowly. Elena came around the desk. "What is it?" Jonas pointed. The movement trail showed a cluster around Sierra Grain, then a break, then something stranger. One line veering away, heading west, pausing, then turning back toward the same danger it had just escaped. "That's not random," Elena said. "No." Rook ran out, and then went back. Elena folded her arms, looking from the screen to the dog and back again. "Why would an injured animal do that?" Jonas didn't answer right away. He was still watching the line on the screen, as if it might change shape if he doubted it hard enough. There were only a few reasons a dog like this would return to a place associated with pain. Training was one. Loyalty was another. Sometimes the two became impossible to separate. He looked over at Rook. The dog had not lowered his head. He was watching Jonas with that same amber, evaluating gaze, and Jonas felt a quiet chill move through him. Not because he believed in omens. He didn't. But some truths arrived with the same stillness as one. He didn't just survive, Jonas said. He tried to go back for something. Or someone, he thought, but did not say. Elena heard it anyway. "You think Mercer was still alive?" "I think Rook thought he might be." That changed the room. Up until then, everything had held at least a little distance. Files, roots, coded hardware. Even Harlan's disappearance had the abstraction of a missing man whose absence had not yet been given a body. But the idea of the dog turning back, not in panic, not in confusion, but out of intention, put blood back into the story. Elena rested one hand on the desk. If he went back once, he may still be trying to finish something. Jonas looked again at the creek location on the map. It no longer felt like a point of origin. It felt like a place something had tried very hard to hide inside. The next morning, the town made its feelings known more clearly. At the auto shop where Jonas normally had his truck serviced, the owner, a square, balding man named Pete Collier with thick wrists and the permanent grease shadow of a mechanic's life, barely met his eyes. Pete had known Jonas 2 years and once loaned him a trailer jack without asking for a deposit. Today he kept wiping a socket wrench already clean. "You hear from Harlan?" Jonas asked. Pete's jaw worked once. "No." "You lying?" Pete looked up then, not angry, just tired in a way that made anger seem like a luxury.